Hello everybody, I hope you're doing well. In this video I'm going to be talking about landscape photography books, and in particular my favourite landscape photography books that have provided me a lot of inspiration in recent years. I'm also going to mention my new landscape photography book, The Great Wilderness, which I launched last year but haven't really mentioned on this channel, so that's going to be at the end of this video. But with Christmas coming up, hopefully this is useful if you're looking for a last minute present for a keen photographer, or if you yourself are a photographer just looking for something to enjoy over the winter period. So let's get started. We're going to start with two photographers who belong in the pantheon of great British landscape photographers, and that's Colin Prior and Paul Wakefield. Colin's book Fragile is my favourite of his very many books of the Scottish Highlands, because it's a simple, elegant concept delivered flawlessly. So Colin is photographing birds' eggs against white backgrounds, which allows you to see the eggs as objects of art in their own right. And I have to say they are beautifully technically photographed to just allow the eggs to really shine on the page. It's really beautiful just in its own right, just for the bird's eggs. But what makes this really clever is he's taken those eggs and paired them with the landscape that the bird lives in, quite often making colour connections between the egg and the landscape. So there's this lovely synergy between the two as you go through the book. There's also a good deal of variety in there. There's some beautiful written sections. Colin writes very well about the ecology of the Scottish Highlands and bird habitats and so on. And he's also using double page spreads or multiple images on some pages just to create a bit of variety so that it doesn't become too repetitious as you go through the book. So have a look at that one. It's a great one to start off with. Just a really, really clever book. And I think having a strong concept when you're producing a book is absolutely critical to it being successful. Next up we have Paul Wakefield's The Landscape, which is the best example I have of a photographer's portfolio book. So a collection of work spanning maybe decades in this case, across multiple ecosystems. So there's not necessarily a geographic connection or a really strong theme to link these images. This is a photographer's statement of who they are as a photographer, and this book is simply incredible. If you really want to impress somebody with a gift, then this is a great book to choose, because it's beautifully bound with this matte grey book cloth, a lovely inset cover, but it's also very large, and the images inside are huge, sometimes spreading across 2 pages on the most beautiful paper and printed to the very highest standard. So it really is a fantastic example of publishing as well. But there are some fantastic images in this book, really interesting compositions, somebody who has developed his understanding of how to photograph the landscape over many, many years. And it's a level of photography that few other photographers are achieving even now. So really recommend checking that one out. Amazingly, I think he only did a print run of 850 and there's still some available. So do have a look for that on his website. Now we're on to a couple of books that focus on geographic areas, which is my preferred approach for producing my own books. This is Eric Bennett's Space, Stillness, Silence, which I believe is his second book. Certainly I have his previous book, Conversations with Nature, which is fantastic, but this is a maturing of his work into a really coherent collection of work that flows beautifully as you go through the book, presenting these different desert landscapes of southern Utah. Eric shoots predominantly in a more intimate style, so there are grand scenic images incorporating skies, but more often we see more intimate views, really clever compositions, often picking up on details and patterns, but also sometimes constructing really quite complex scenes, and all perfectly executed. Eric is really finessed when it comes to image editing, so you get these incredibly realistic impressions of nature throughout this book. But he's also a very clever photographer with some of the scenes he chooses to photograph. So do have a look at that, particularly if you're interested in desert landscapes in the US, because I can't think of a better example than this book. Next up, we've got Theo Bosboom's Back to Iceland, and if you don't know who Theo is, then where have you been in recent years? Because he is one of the most original and creative landscape photographers out there, and certainly this book is no exception, focusing of course on Iceland, but showing a real diversity of landscapes, of course focusing on the natural side, but not afraid to tackle some of the man-made elements in Iceland and combine them with those wilder landscapes. So there's some really fascinating image pairings in here. That's another aspect of book design that I think is incredibly important, that is done really cleverly in this book. I mean, there's some really unusual examples combining two images together that don't really seem to fit from a contextual perspective or a subject perspective, but from a color, tonal or pattern perspective work beautifully together. So that's what really stands out to me about this book. And I know that Sandra Bartocha, who we're about to talk about with the next book, had her hand in the design and some of the sequencing here as well. So you can maybe see her influence there. But Theo's work is really, really fascinating. I do recommend checking out his work and subscribing to all of his social channels as well, because it's just a fantastic source of inspiration for me, and I'm sure it will be for you too. Last but certainly not least is Sandra Bartocha's Rhythm of Nature. Sandra is a German photographer and she's also a brilliant book designer. So this book is the best example I have of just what can be achieved in a photography book with perfect design, layout, sequencing and cover design. I mean, the cover here really is fantastic. You've got a printed book cloth which also is foiled over the top with a pattern that matches the image on the book cloth. It really is fantastic. But inside you have a sequence of images of more of an intimate style, more of an impressionistic style, so very different to the illustrative approach that I take. But there's a really beautiful flow going through the book. So Rhythm of Nature is exactly what you get here. And it's a book that's very difficult to describe really without going through it yourself, but it's beautifully printed onto a matte paper. And I know that Sandra is really on it with every last detail of this book, from the binding to the printing to the layouts and so on. It really is a superb example of what can be achieved if you're willing to put the time and effort into every last detail of a book. So it really is superb and I highly recommend it. So before we get onto my own book, I've got a bit of a bonus selection for you here. If you are just looking for as much inspiration from as many sources as possible, then consider a competition book. And there is no better competition book for landscape photography than the Natural Landscape book, which is the competition book for the Natural Landscape Photography Awards, which I am an organizer for, although I have fairly little involvement with this book. This is volume 3. Volume 4 is just coming out, with each volume incrementally slightly improving upon the previous one, with some fantastic design work by Tim Parkin and essays by photographers that have been commissioned for the purpose of this book. And it represents a whole range of ecosystems, of photographic approaches and styles. We've got abstracts, intimates and grand landscapes all represented equally beautifully. There really isn't a bad image in any of these books. So if you just want inspiration, do check out this volume 3 or volume 4 of the Natural Landscape book. And finally, it's the plug you've all been waiting for, my book, The Great Wilderness, which is a project that I worked on for 4 years. It was an enormous effort, both physically hiking out into this remote area in northwest Scotland, but also creatively coming up with all of the shot ideas, executing them, putting them all together, and then thinking about every last aspect of this book. And I have put up a previous video which goes into that in some more depth. But this book has been available for about a year now, and I've not really mentioned it on this channel. I really should have done, but it has done well. I've got about a third of my stock left. If you'd like a copy, then it's a fantastic way to support this channel. So hopefully you've enjoyed this video. Some really exceptional photography books from a whole range of photographers around the world. I hope you enjoy photography books as much as I do. If you don't already have a collection started, maybe this is your bit of encouragement to get going, because I have got a lot out of photography books over the years, and as I said, it's a really fantastic way to explore the work of other photographers.